everyone? Yes? Okay. So thank you for being here today. I'm Anna, and I'm part of Brattleboro Solidarity and the Spark Teacher Institute. Once again, I just want to congratulate our graduates that are in the room. Earlier this week, a report by a panel of leading scientists came out warning that 1 million plant and animal species could go extinct in the foreseeable future due to human activity. It was the largest global study on biodiversity ever. It called not just as an environmental issue, but also an economic issue. That being said, we are really excited to have Fred Magdoff here to help us all understand this better, push our articulation, analysis, and action. Fred is an emeritus professor of plant and soil science at the University of Vermont. His interests range from soil science to agriculture and food to the environment and the U.S. economy. Recent books include What Every Environmentalist Needs to Know About Capitalism, written with John Bellamy Foster, and Creating an Ecological Society, written with Chris Williams. And both those books are in the back that will be on sale during lunch. Fred is a good friend of the Spark Education Institute. He's always welcome in Brattleboro, and I know many of us have used his writings in our teaching. So just to quote Fred from his book, Creating an Ecological Society, "It is the job of everyone who wishes to see a better world, one that we have demonstrated is eminently possible, to take up the fight. How that looks will be different in every city, region, and country. But the common thread will be the objective of building the strength of our movement, thereby weakening their capitalist system. Whenever people move into individual struggles, we must be with them and seek to expand, deepen, and connect their separate struggles into one unified fight against capitalism." So with that, I'm going to give you Fred. He's going to talk for about 40 minutes. I'm going to cut him off very smoothly at around 40 minutes, and then we'll have about 20 minutes for question and answer. So let's welcome Fred.
Thank you for the introduction, and it really is a pleasure to be here. I'm going to try to use a microphone because I know my voice doesn't carry terribly well. Those books are back there. If you'd like to purchase them, you can. I'd be happy to sign them. Although I'm only one author. I have a clear conscience in flogging the books, as they say, because I don't get any royalties. So it's all monthly review. I'm not gaining if you purchase a book or don't. But I think they have there's an opportunity within them, especially the latest one, Creating an Ecological Society, if you're in a study group with other people, I think it's an ideal book to be used in that way, for people to learn just about the environment, to learn about social problems, to learn about capitalism, also what is possible, what technologies and ideas are out there, and we go through also the supposed stumbling blocks to a different society and why these really are not stumbling blocks. So there's a lot of different types of discussion in there about all sorts of issues, from women's fashions to why people have certain diseases, to all, from A to Z, basically. Okay, I wanted to at least mention briefly before getting into the subject. First off, I'll go in before that. Even the title of this, which is Consequences of the Capitalist System toward a Vision of Collective Emancipation, this title would not have been used as a title for a talk. I don't even think that this group 10 years ago. Capitalism was a word that just wasn't used. 10, 15 years ago, you just didn't hear it used at all. You could go through introductory economics at the university and not hear the word capitalism. They talked about market economy, they talked about this and that. The leading textbook on economics did not have the word capitalism in it, even though what it was teaching was capitalist economics. That was by Samuelson, by the way. So it's interesting. We're in a period where we can talk about the system. We can give it a name, the name that it was always given, although not used a lot for a long period of time. And we have an opportunity to dissect it and to explain what are the problems with the system itself. I'm not going to get into this in any detail, but I think we have to at least pay attention to the fact that capitalism was born as a system of robbery, slavery, thievery, etc. So this was the development of the capital system is, as it developed, is almost unthinkable without the plunder of the Americas, without the taking of the resources, the opening up of the lands that were taken from the Native Americans, and without slavery. Slavery was integral to the beginning of industrial capitalism. And I just wanted to read just a little piece from the book, which is not much at all, and there's a quote from somebody else. Because of the significance of cotton and its critical role in the rise of the Industrial Revolution and the role of enslaved labor played in the producing cotton and sugar, the importance of slavery to the economic development of the United States and Britain cannot be overemphasized. As historian Walter Johnson has written, in the years before the Civil War, there was no capitalism without slavery. The two were in many ways one and the same. It is not simply that the labor of enslaved people underwrote 19th century capitalism. Enslaved people were the capital. 4 million people worth at least $3 billion in 1860, which was more than all the capital invested in railroads and factories of the United States combined. Seen in this light, the conventional distinction between slavery and capitalism fades into meaninglessness. Okay, so when I was growing up and took American history in high school, capitalism was viewed as, slavery was viewed as a sort of a bad thing that happened, but really not that important to the whole system. And that just isn't true. And there's a lot of information, a lot of historians that have written about it, and if anybody wants citations for more information, I'd be happy to. Okay, well, we have a system in crisis. I don't think there's any question about that. And you can go to some pretty big hotshots who agree with that statement. There are a number of very wealthy people and some liberal intellectuals who are actually concerned with the problem that capitalism creates. They're concerned over the potential social instability. That's the fear of pitchforks. You know, in the old times, the peasants would come with pitchforks to try to overtake the owners. This is a quote. These are just quotes of headlines from the last few weeks. April 22nd. Why American CEOs are worried about capitalism. That was in the Financial Times, one of the major financial journals in the world, out of Britain. Capitalism is failing workers. People want a job with a decent wage. Why is that so hard? April 24th, The Guardian of Britain. 6 people who prove capitalism is broken in America. May 2nd, okay, in The Guardian. Nature is capitalism's biggest loser. This is in a Reuters dispatch, you know, the news agency, from May 6th. From May 8th in The Guardian, How to Fix Capitalism, 9 expert solutions for America's broken system. And they're concerned, not all of them, obviously, but there is concern in the ruling class. There is concern among some of the wealthy people. Are they concerned that poor people are poor and they have problems? No. They're concerned about the stability of the system. If the divergence is too great, if the inequality is too great, they're concerned that people towards the bottom are going to rise up and fight back. Yeah, they're concerned about you. They are. There's no doubt about it. I'm serious. They are. So, so this is not. This is a timely topic. Okay. So, what are the symptoms of this system in crisis? Well, there's environmental destruction all around us, and this is not just climate change, which I'll get to in a second, but we have pollution of the air, the water, the soil, and the beings. We are polluted with all sorts of chemicals, with plastics, chemicals that make up plastics, and their decomposition products that, as they're decomposed in our body. We have them in us. I mean, if you want to get scared, check your urine and blood. There are laboratories that will do it, and like 90% of the people in the United States are contaminated with BPA's. I don't know what happened to the rest of them, but the other 10% must live pretty isolated lives. But it's nearly impossible not to come in contact with plastic or flame retardants. If you have any foam at home in a cushion, those by law have to use flame retardants, and when you sit on them, some dust comes out, some chemicals come out, and so we are contaminated with a variety of materials. So there's changing land use as forests are cut frequently and burned in order to convert to pastures. That's mainly in the Amazonian region, or oil palm plantations, which is mainly in Southeast Asia. It was already mentioned by Anna about the species extinctions. 40% of the insect species are in decline. That was an April report from this year, and the summary that was just released on May 6th about hundreds of international experts about potentially 1 million species of plants and animals in danger. Global warming, which is, I think, probably the most critical issue, and with the largest long-term effect, related, of course, to climate change. Acidification of the oceans is part of that also, because of CO2 dissolves in the ocean. The last 4 years were the warmest years on record globally. Okay. Last summer's heat wave in the United States, I don't know if you remember it, but I do. In Europe, in Asia, Japan hit the hottest temperature that it ever reached. I think it was 106 degrees, close to 40 degrees Fahrenheit. In Pakistan and other countries, also very, very high temperatures. Forest fires blazed in the United States, in Europe, even north of the Arctic Circle. There were fires this last year. And by the way, many people died. When you have heat waves, quite a few people died. It was a very terrible heat wave in Europe. I'm trying to remember what the date was, maybe 10 years ago, maybe a little more, where it's estimated 30,000 people died during that heat wave in Europe. This is in Europe. We're not talking about in a poor country. Intense storms. The storms are getting more intense. We know about the rainstorms. Harvey that hit Houston just a few years ago. You'd say, well, that's a fluke. Houston is being flooded today. Okay, there are intense storms that hit yesterday, the day before. They're more than is supposed to be coming today. And we have a reflooding, and it flooded before Harvey. That wasn't the first time Houston was flooded. And the dry regions are becoming even drier. So places in the Middle East, parts of Central America, one of the drivers of the migration to the north from Central America is the drying conditions. In addition, of course, to the horrible political conditions, which are largely to blame. The United States is largely to blame. Then there's vast social issues, the inequality of wealth and income, which I alluded to before. You have poor that are, this includes working people who exist even within very wealthy countries. The economic power of the wealthy, of the wealth and their interests have overwhelmed the political process. You have rampant racism, oppression of women, people of various gender identifications, and these have physiological effects on people. There was, when Chris and I were working on the book, Creating an Ecological Society, I came across the issue that African American men have relatively high incidence of hypertension, of high blood pressure. And there are these geneticists looking for the genetic explanation for it. Well, the problem is that Africans don't have particularly high blood pressure. And Africans living in rural areas actually have low blood pressure than is normal in the Western world. And so this is not an issue of genetics, it's an issue of living in a racist society. And what's come out relatively recently, I'm talking about the last year or so, has been that African American women have much more trouble with childbirth than do white women in the United States. Again, this is not a genetic factor. Okay? This has to do with racism. It has to do with the internalization of this racist culture, and of course, also with less access to quality medical care. But even when there is access to good quality medical care, it is still a problem. The U.S. uses wars and threats of wars, as well as immense economic and political power, to try to bend nations to its will. Tens of thousands of Venezuelans have estimated to have died because of the American sanctions that have occurred in that country, and that they have continued to exist. That they put down this silly coup that happened a week and a half ago or so, and how they put it down so easily by the mass of people coming out is an example that they're willing to fight, even in the face of such adversity and such deprivation of medical supplies and food supplies, etc., which is being caused in a number of ways by United States sanctions. Okay, so what's causing these problems? So we've got all these environmental problems, we've got all these social issues, and I'm not trying to list them all. I'm trying to group what I think are probably the more important ones. People place the blame in many places. One of the most common ones you hear is there are just too many people in the world. And there's just too many of them. Not only that, that we all consume too much. We're just natural-born consumers, and we consume. And the real problem is this issue. Of course, the problem really isn't that there's too many people in the world. The problem with regard to resource use, with regard to pollution, is that there are too many wealthy people living too high off the hog. And if you take the top 10% of the income and wealth individuals in the world and say you have to live as the rest of the world has to live, the average of the rest of the 90%, then we could drop our CO2 emissions by over 30%, we could drop our resource use by 30 to 40% as well, globally I'm talking about. So the problem isn't poor people, the answer isn't birth control for poor people, the answer is birth control for rich people and confiscating their wealth. If you're concerned with those issues, okay? So I've also heard this, we're just naturally destructive people, a species. Human beings are just naturally, destructive. This is our human nature. And we have a whole chapter in the Creating an Ecological Society on human nature. I'm not going to get into that, but it's a ridiculous claim, of course. Then we hear also that the poor are to blame for their situation, right? If they only worked harder, if they only gone to college, if only they didn't have a baby or whatever it is, made better decisions, they'd be doing fine. Okay. So the idea is you blame the victim. And in essence, we are blaming ourselves also when we say consumption is just too high, that's a problem generalized in the society. We're blaming everybody instead of blaming the ones that are really at fault here. So if humanity is the problem, if the poor are their problem, then everybody's guilty and nobody's to blame. Okay? I mean, there's no individual that you can help, or no group, or no class. And the problem with all of these so-called answers is that they really are made by people who can't get outside of the box. And the box is what I wanted to talk about, is capitalism. If you can't get outside the box of capitalism, if you can't think outside, if you can't think of it as a system, then you can't really analyze why these problems are occurring. You can't, I think, get to the root of the problem. So capitalism is a system which simply stated, and I'm not trying to give an exhaustive discussion of this, it's based on hiring labor to produce goods and services to sell at a profit. Okay? That's the purpose of capitalism. The purpose of production is to make a commodity or a service and sell it for more than it cost you to produce it. That's it. That's the whole system right there. I mean, there's obviously other layers. You need markets in order to be able to sell it. Okay, there are other issues there. You get classes developed because of some people hire workers and other people are managers and some other people are owners of the businesses. So there are different classes that are involved as well. But it is the quest for profits that motivates capitalism and capitalists and drives the system. There's no such thing as enough money. Greed is an essential ingredient of the system. If you're not greedy, you can't be a good capitalist. You want to have more money. You want to be able to compete with this other company over there and sell more of your stuff rather than they sell more of their stuff. Okay, there's competition for market share. There was an article a few years ago in the New York Times magazine section about the fast food industry, and it talked about the competition for share of your stomach, right? They're competing, my junk food versus your junk food. That guy's junk food. I want you to buy my junk food. Why? Because, is it better? Oh, it's just as junky as that one. But I'm going to make the profits from it instead of the other company over here. Okay, so capitalists invest money in order to make profits, in order to live a high life, and to invest more money in order to make more profits. In order to invest those profits, in order to make more money, and it goes around and around and around. Okay, there's no end to the system. There's no natural place where you can say enough is enough. So it's an economic system that impels growth. It has to grow. If the system isn't growing, if capitalism isn't growing, it is in crisis. This is what happened in 2007, the end of 2007, really 2008, 2009, the so-called Great Recession, where it stopped growing for a few years, and that was a disaster for many working people. So, as Herman Daly put it, an economist at the University of Maryland, who's retired now, infinite growth on a finite planet is impossible. And I would add to that, on the other hand, there is no such thing as no growth capitalism. It is also impossible. You can't, there's no such beast. One of the things that capitalism does, in order to sell all this tremendous quantity, volume of goods that are produced, is it's got to convince you to buy stuff. It's got to turn people into consumers, into voracious consumers. This is how it was put in the Journal of Retailing in 1955. Okay, this isn't recent. This is not a radical journal. This is a very interesting article. If anybody wants it, I have the whole article. I'm just quoting a little piece of it. There's a little more quoted in the book. This is by Victor Lebeau. Our enormously productive economy demands that we make consumption our way of life, that we convert the buying and use of goods into rituals, that we seek our spiritual satisfaction, our ego satisfactions in consumption. This guy is talking to business people. Right? They were concerned about how we're going to get rid of all of this stuff. There's a guy who wrote a book, which is the book used in marketing courses in university. His name is Philip Kotler. It was in his 14th edition, the last I know. This is a quote from him, not from his book, in the interview. If there are no more needs, by which I mean everything we can think of, there's somebody supplying it, then we have to invent new needs. Now, I know that's been criticized. People say, why are you doing that to us? Why don't you leave us alone? But part of the capitalism is, this is this guy talking, okay, this is not me talking. Part of capitalism is, it's a system where we've got to motivate people to want things so they'll work for these things. So they'll buy more stuff. Okay? So if there are no more wants, you've got to create more wants, and then wants are being created all the time. There's something like 40,000 new products coming available every year. And they may just be modifications of old ones. I once got into an argument with a guy on the internet. I've forgotten where he was. It was in some group that I was corresponding with. And he said, well, we are natural-born consumers. And I said, well, we do consume. Obviously, people consume a lot. But why would corporations spend approximately $1 trillion a year to try to convince you to buy stuff? That's the sales effort. $1 trillion a year annually spent in the United States. I mean, it's incredible what is done through the media, through computers now, how they can target you directly to try to convince you to buy stuff. And there's no such thing, you know, there's enough stuff. You fill up your house. There's a growth industry in storage facilities, by the way. So if you run out of place to store all your stuff, you can rent one of these storage facilities. I don't know if they have them around Brattleboro, but there are a few around Burlington. And so that's fine. We've got a solution for it. And I'm going to make money on it because I own the storage facility, right? So all the better. More economic activity. If you haven't seen it, and I think it's something that could be useful in classes for older students, I don't know how many of you are teachers, there's a video called Advertising at the Edge of the Apocalypse. It's available through Acorn, which is a streaming service. No, not Acorn. Excuse me, it's Canopy. Burlington Library has access to Canopy. I don't know if other local libraries. That's spelled with a K, Canopy. And Advertising at the Edge of the Apocalypse. It's a very interesting video about advertising and the importance, role it plays. Okay. And now we're getting sort of to one of the hearts of the issue. And one of the ones that's difficult, I have found it difficult to explain to people who were not willing to open their thoughts, their minds. There is no internal mechanism in the system of capitalism to take into account social and environmental concerns. Okay? The only thing you can think about are profits. Okay? That is how the system functions. Let me read you a quote from a person who was at a meeting. This quote also from the book from Creating an Ecological Society. Was at a meeting in London's financial district, which is called London Square Mile. And so this guy is describing the meeting that he was at. A group of Indonesian businessmen organized a lunch to raise 300 million pounds, sterling that is, to finance the clearing of a rainforest and the construction of a pulp paper plant. What struck me is how financial rationalism often overcomes common sense, that profit itself is a good thing, whatever the activity, whatever the occasion. What happened to the Indonesian rainforest was dependent upon financial decisions made over lunch that day. The financial benefits would come to the institutions in London, Paris, or New York. Very little, if any, would go to the local people. The rainforest may be geographically located in the Far East, but financially, it might as well be located in London Square Mile, the financial district. So what happens to the people who are living in the forest or using the resources of the forest? What about the animals? And what about the plants? There is no way to account for them, no way to take them into account, no way to consider them. These are rational financial decisions that are irrational social and ecological decisions. Okay? And because of this, and because of this vast consumption, you have enormous quantities of waste that are generated not only by people consuming much more than is needed, going out to purchase all new fashions, new gadgets, new appliances, but also by the military industrial complex, which is a vast waste of resources. And the greatest polluter, by the way, the greatest producer of CO2 in the United States by far is the military aspect of the government. So, so the way I see it is that capitalism, if it did create these conditions, it made them worse. Some of them it created actually, and others it just made worse and made more difficult. There have been many responses to this, but the responses have been by fragmented organizations, by groups that are concerned with social justice one way or another. I've got a list of 80 that I made up of organizations that are, you know, working on all sorts of good things. Some of them large and that you know of, like Greenpeace and Oxfam, but there's Global Justice, the Global Justice Ecology Project, the Campaign to Stop GE Trees, Biofuel Watch, Earth Justice, Indigenous Climate Action, Idle No More, the Canadian group. My goodness, Black Lives Matter, the National Black Justice Coalition, Humane Farming Association, Migrant Justice in Vermont here, Vermont Land, the Food Bank, Chittenden County, the Emergency Food Shelf. There are various peasant movements around the world. There are just all sorts of groups that are out there. And in the United States, there must be thousands of them, working on all very important issues. Okay, from environment and many different takes on the environment to social issues and many different concentrations on different aspects of the social issues. But it's my contention that these really are related to one another, that you can't solve them individually, that there is no solution to the environmental problem unless we have a solution to the social problems, unless we have jobs for everyone. There's no solution to the environmental justice issue. And let me just read from a headline from May 6th. First slavery, then a chemical plant, and cancer deaths. One town's good history. This is in Louisiana. Okay, this is from an article in the newspaper. Let's just take an example of one issue, which is one of the important issues that we face in the United States and globally. It's an issue as well. What would it take to end racism in the United States? And I tried to think this through, and I'm not saying that I've come up with everything. But when I went to see James Baldwin, the movie that was just made out of it, I'm Not Your Negro. I don't know if you've seen that, but it's definitely worth seeing. It's a very interesting movie on many different levels. Lots of good footage of Baldwin as well. But I walked out of that thinking, there's no way in the world that this is going to be solved under our system. And I started thinking, well, what would be needed to solve it? What would we actually need to do to solve racism in the United States? And this is a list I came up with, and I'm sure there may be other things to add to it. A good job at a decent wage for all working age people. Comfortable and pleasant housing for all families. Everyone has access, or should have access, to high quality education, pleasant buildings conducive to learning. Universal access to quality health care. A long-term, multi-generational, continuing educational effort that begins with toddlers aimed at teaching equality and cooperation, encouraging meaningful integration, and combating stereotypes. So that's the list I came up with. Like I said, you may have others, and they may be good ones for others. There is no way in the world that's going to happen, that the resources are going to be devoted to doing that in this country. I just don't see it in this system. If there's a war, sure, we'll devote resources to it. To solve social problems, no. There's lip service that gets but not a real solution. Okay, so I just think one of the real issues is how do we get the various social and ecological justice groups working 5 minutes? My God. They don't go over it by a couple of minutes. When you really need it to go, you got to drag me out. I think one of the big issues is how do we get everybody working together? How do we get these various groups together? In what form do they get together? Is it a coalition, or do you try to find, or you try to form a united group itself, or party? How can we start to talk to people about capitalism within the groups that we are currently in? And that really is the bottom line issue that needs to be talked about, because we need an alternative. And also, how can we work to transform ourselves and our behaviors as we struggle for a new society? Right? We can't just say, oh, all the problems are going to be solved by a new society. They may or may not be. But we need to be transforming ourselves as part of the process. And some of the organizations that are working for change are doing that. And the Kurds have a very interesting policy. I'm talking about Turkey now and northern Syria, of working on the issue of oppression of women. And they've come a long way, they really have, as far as dealing with that issue in the home and in the community. The Zapatistas are doing the same. I saw also examples of that type of behavior, trying to modify behavior with the MST, the Landless Workers Movement in Brazil, trying to change people as we're trying to change society. Because we can't just change society and all of a sudden expect people to change. We need to be changing ourselves and within our organizations. So what is an alternative? We've got to replace the current system in which the major economic and social decisions are made by the wealthy and individual capitalists and corporations. They decide what to do, what they will do that can bring them the greatest profit. This is a system in which the mass of the people, that is, everyone in this room, has two roles. You've got two roles under capitalism. You should be a good worker, don't complain, be passive, do what the boss tells you to do, and be a voracious consumer. Buy as much as you can, and if you can't, just borrow more money, mortgage your house, get a car on a loan, run up your credit cards, buy more and more. That is your role under capitalism. So people are at the service of the economy. Okay, well, what if we turn that around and say, what if we had an economy that was at the service of people, of humanity? In other words, just flip it. This would mean a system under social control by the people that puts the needs of the people first. And that includes, by the way, a healthy and biodiverse ecosystem with its cycles and flows fully functioning. Okay, so I don't divorce the needs of people from the needs of the environment. I consider the needs of the environment as one of our human needs. In this system, the whole purpose of production would be to supply everyone with what's needed for each to reach their full human potential, to live a good life, or buen vivir, as they talk about in Latin America, instead of producing a commodity to sell at a higher price than the cost of production. A system in which decisions about what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, take into account social and ecological considerations. A system in which such decisions are made democratically by workers and communities with bottom-up organizing and planning. A system of substantive equality, I think, is essential. I don't see how you can have an ecological society without it being a society of equality. A system that can experiment, evaluate their progress, and make any needed corrections. An economic and political system under democratic social control, that is, of the people, of the workers, of the communities in which these production units exist. That is socialism. That is the word for it. This offers the only possible way to resolve the economic, social, and ecological issues of capitalist society. It doesn't guarantee that all problems will be solved or adequately addressed. But it offers a path forward, one that is currently blocked by the way capitalism normally functions. So I want to stress that at the end. If we have the opportunity to make rational decisions, that is, rationally economically, rationally socially, not just rational instead of rational from a point of view of profits, that doesn't mean we're going to make the right decisions all the time. but it gives us the option that we don't have now of taking these important issues into consideration as decisions are being made, instead of completely ignoring them, like those folks who are making decisions about the rainforest in Indonesia. And so this is, to me, the heart of the issue. It is taking a system in which there is no rational way to make economic and, to make a social and environmental considerations part of the decision-making process, transforming it into one in which those become the heart of the process. And that is, to me, the way forward. The question in my mind is, how do you convince people of that? And that's one of the purposes of Chris and I writing this book, and John Bellamy Foster and I writing the previous book. And I think I better end on that. But before I end, there's one more thing I want to mention. Monthly Review is a monthly magazine, been in operation for 70 years. Started by Paul Sweezy and Leo Huberman. My father edited it for many years. I had 5 copies of it back there for free from a few months ago. If anyone wants a subscription to it, could you give your name to Nancy in the back there? And I'd be happy to make sure you get a year's free subscription to the magazine and see if it's for you. May or may not, but just for your interest. Anyhow, I overwent by some minutes.
Stay up there.
Okay. I overwent by some minutes.
Question and answer, and I'm just going to kind of help facilitate that for Fred. We're going to leave the mic apparatus up there. So just really shout out your question so everyone can hear it.
Yeah.
Hi, Fred. I went to school at Antioch University and studied under Tom Wessels before doing the Spark program. And I'm wondering if you could address why so many ecologists, such as Bill McKibben and those at Antioch, cannot break outside of that box of capitalism in their thinking. And I would also include folks like Bill McKibben in that as well.
It's a very good question. It's a very good question, and I wish I had the answer. I think, who was it? I'm trying to remember who it was. Isaac. A person came up with a statement saying that it is easier for most people to imagine, the end of the world than the end of capitalism. and I think it's true. This is all we know. So we figure this is, this is the way it is. This is the way it's, as far as we know, it's always been, because it's always been that way in our childhood. Of course, for at least 95% of our existence as a species, we live in egalitarian societies, in hunting-gathering societies. The species is 200,000, they say now possibly 300,000 years old. And for up until 5,000 to 10,000 years ago, that's how we lived as a species. We lived with very different characteristics. Cooperation was essential. Okay? Competition was frowned upon, actually. Competition here is essential. That is in capitalism. So I think it's inculcated in us, and I think these are very smart people, very decent people. McKibben's latest, where did I read it? He's got a piece. Oh, I know where I'm at. I won't go into it, but it's something that will be available in about a month, I think, or a month and a half to everyone. Where he wrote a piece that's being critiqued within a group, and then it's going to be made available. He can answer them. He sort of, he was asked to address the question of system change, like climate change, system change issue. And so he mentions capitalism, but then he gets off on a tangent, and he sort of diverts the issue. And I think one of the things that I came across was that people who are concerned about these issues, as well they should be, they are so concerned that things have to be done now, that if we don't fight the fight now, and this pipeline and that pipeline, and try to divest this university of its stock in Exxon or whatever, that we're just not going to have enough time for system change. And my answer to that is, it's not one or the other. You've got to be fighting for fights now. You know, for social fights now, you can't say, oh, well, we're gonna wait for a new society. Meanwhile, racism, homophobia, whatever, you know, oppression of women, let that just go on. You know, of course not. I mean, we have to fight these fights now. But the question is, how do we get to the issue, that the bottom line issue is systemic, that these are systemic issues. And by that reason, they're all interrelated, and they can't be solved independently in isolation. So I don't know, I've been beating around the bush with you on this because I don't have a good answer. I have tried. I've tried, not personally with Bill McKibben, but I know people who have. He mentions Naomi Klein's book, her previous book, the one, This Changes Everything, Crime and Capitalism. And which also is a little bit wishy-washy. You know, it's got some very good stuff, and she's wonderful. But she's a little bit wishy-washy on the capitalism issue, although it's in the subtitle of the book. So I don't know. I've been. Anybody know about the Land Institute? It's out in Kansas. They're breeding perennial grains to try to change annuals into perennials, and they're doing good stuff. They've got good people there. I was asked to come out and talk about capitalism, which was interesting in and of itself. But and they're willing to say, okay, you know, capitalism, yeah, probably capitalism is the issue, and then they just drop it. You know, my answer to them is, if you really believe that, then we have to start talking about alternatives. I mean, Chris Williams and I wrote this book not for it to be a Bible, not for it to be the last word, is to open up the discussion. Where do we go? And how do we think about it? You know, what's sort of the basic operating premises of a different system which would operate in an ecologically and socially sound way, socially just way. And so, anyway, David Orr I would put in that category also, an environmental educator who's now retired, and you know, they sort of know the score, but they don't really. They don't feel it viscerally. Maybe they've heard it enough, so they sort of say, yeah, maybe it's true, but they just want to go on to deal with the media. Yeah.
Johnny, you have a question? And then Nancy, yeah, let's go to Johnny and then.
Just in addition, it's not only the alternatives, but the opposition to capitalism, I think, is very problematic for a lot of people.
Yeah, I think they think they'll be just too far out there, you know, and that will lessen their credibility. I mean, that may be part of it. Maybe they know better, but they're concerned that they're not going to be. I'm just trying to give them the sort of the benefit of the doubt. And there will be problems for people who say things like that. I don't think there's any doubt about it. They will become, you know, in certain circles that they now are in. They will not be viewed very kindly.
Nancy, you want to go
Just,
for it?
in that Naomi Klein book you mentioned, one of the huge gaping holes is she doesn't mention the military industrial complex at all. And it feels like, I mean, I've been a climate justice activist for quite a while, and we're guilty of that too. I mean, it almost never gets talked about, and I don't even understand why I'm not talking about it more, but it feels like most of the organizations doing climate justice work are ignoring the massive amount of resources and absolutely terrible things that the military is doing to our environment as well as our world. And you know, I know every time I hear a talk like this, it makes me more determined to start talking more about the military-industrial complex. But why do you think the climate justice movement has really just been sort of silent most of the time on that really critical issue?
Again, I don't know the answer, but part of it may be also the same thing with the capitalism issue, in that it will create problems for you working in certain circles, especially if you're an NGO, by the way, and you're getting money from certain funding sources. To start talking in those terms, you know, you're really, you're going too far. You're going beyond the veil, you know, and there's certain acceptable ranges, and I think maybe McKibben has sort of reached the acceptable range.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you. While you are speaking, I was just thinking like you try to answer all the questions, how to defeat capitalism. But for the people that are living under direct oppression, they don't care to answer all these kinds of questions. They care first about to end their own oppression. And sometimes this is what I'm worried about. And I'm a Palestinian, I live in Palestine and for 71 years still under the Israeli occupation, where sometimes our intellectuals, I'm not just speaking about Palestinian, where they to make the things, slow the struggle because they try to answer the questions. While the movement of the people living under direct oppression, they are struggling, resisting, and try to move on. And we experienced that actually during our struggle. And here we are again. I'm not saying we need to answer all the questions. And some of the questions maybe we need just to destroy, when I say like liberation, no beautiful liberation. And there is no beautiful resistance. It's ugly. And sometimes to do that, first we need to destroy, finish, and maybe later we can answer some of these questions.
No, I agree. I mean, if a people is under occupation, I think they have, in my opinion, they have a right to resist. Whether that makes sense or not is up to them to decide how they do it, and they should be supported in their resistance. And I put the Palestinian situation in analogous to what was in South Africa, because it is apartheid right now in Palestine. You have the equivalent of the Bantustans of South Africa. So yes, liberation should happen now. You shouldn't wait for a change in system. It in and of itself is a change in system, not necessarily capitalism, as they have learned in South Africa, by the way, which was important. It was an important struggle, but they did not change the system, and they're seeing the problems now. With poverty, the whole issue of land reform that was aborted in South Africa, the whole issue of turning over resources to the black population, aside from some of the people that were selected to become wealthy, which is incredible. In my mind, ridiculous in South Africa, but that's what happened, that's what they did. So yeah, I mean, national liberation, yes, absolutely. On the other hand, we have oppressed people, like in the United States, who have been so oppressed. I'm talking about the Native American population. That this is a May 9th. It's 2 days ago. This is the headline of an article in the Guardian. Trauma lives on in Native America by making us sick. This is about the Native American population. They talk about exterminate, remove, assimilate, terminate, relocate. That is what's been done to the Native Americans. Well, they're not talking about national liberation, and they're not going to be. They are so repressed and suppressed that the only way that they're going to break out, I think, is with a system change for the whole country. That's my opinion. Not that it shouldn't happen. I wish it would. But they, I think, have given up to a large extent. And I hope that doesn't happen in the Palestinians.
So I think we have time for one more question. Someone's got a question. Judy.
I have a comment. I'm Native American, and I'm not giving up.
Good. No, I'm glad to hear it. I think that yes, I think there are groups within the community that are, and maybe I misspoke on that. But the repression has been so severe over so many centuries, and the destruction has been so severe, not only of the people, but also of the culture, as you know, and as I think everyone here knows too. That is created to a large degree a passive population.
Well, nobody in Native communities would give up that have children. They want that better life for them.
Right. No, I know that, but I think they've given up what I would call maybe national independence. I'm not sure, or it seems to be, to me. It seems to be different than the way it had been. It seems to be different than the way the Palestinian struggle is and the way the South African struggle is, although it is analogous in some ways.
Well, it is different. The current administration has cut back on treaties, pulled back funding, and so in Maine alone, the average salary of a person living on a reservation is $8,000. So it's difficult to resist if you can't put food in your mouth and clothes on your back.
I want to get one more voice in here. Rose?
I think you're absolutely wrong on that, because she's right. As a Native woman also, I think you're seeing the culture is coming back, the languages are coming back, and with that is an uprising in the 7th generation. You saw it out in the Dakotas during Standing Rock, and more the indigenous people are coming around and saying no. And they are speaking up. So I would absolutely agree that I think you're wrong. It just is a different form and it's in a different shape, true to our culture and our ways.
No, I understand that, and I probably did misspeak maybe a bad analogy there. But yes, I mean, what happened in Standing Rock is nothing short of amazing. Not only what was done by the Native Americans, but also the response by the rest of the country. And also from abroad. And so, I mean, it was incredible and inspiring. So it may be coming back, but there was certainly a long period of really being so repressed, being so exterminated, removed, assimilated, terminated, relocated, that it had such drastic effects for so many years. But yes, there are definitely hopeful signs.
Great, thank you so much for that.
Someone else want to share some
yeah.
observations?
We have some protesters down here who are protesting against this truck which seems to be building some sort of road down here. And I wasn't sure if this guy had crossed the picket line to work or if he's just part of their protest too, but
Is it the other side?
Oh, yeah, no.
Oh, up here.
Yeah.
yeah, so these guys, so we were thinking this guy's like paving a road over where they were living or where they were working, not paying them a fair wage.
Okay. And on the other side, the first one that you got, like the truck has like what the society consumes, like the bread and the capitalism instead of Coca-Cola, and you also have Nescafe down in the bottom, and the truck is just moving fast and just like it's like a cycle. It keeps on going, and there's like a lot of waste around it as well, like the plastic waste. And we notice also like how the bees and how the nature is still like trying to preserve or to keep on. You have the bees are trying to make the honey at the top, and they're still trying to keep on working, but the consumer society always wants more and more, and doesn't really care about what's going to happen to them.
Well, we have the same image too over here, and like one thing we noticed is that the animals who are drumming, who are part of the or are playing music, who are part of the facade for tourists, like they have this kind of happy, you know, kind of like fake-looking grin, and they look kind of kitschy, like they're entertaining tourists. And then the walrus, I think it's a walrus, behind them, who is drumming, like maybe doesn't have the same grin, but there's that like swirly stuff coming out of the drum, so it's like authentic, and it's coming from those people. It's not music that's bought and sold. It's music that people are making to express themselves.
Yes.
Kelly, are those
Are the animals that are in front, are those part of the billboard? It looks like they're like crumbling a little bit. Are those painted on there?
One of them is. That lobster is, I think, but I don't think the walrus
But in the
is.
front, yeah. Also, the truck with the bear that's like angry looking, that's plowing forward or whatever the direction. It seems that the trash that's in front of it might be, we were like discussing whether the ants that are in front of that are creating a barricade with trash.
Yeah.
And so that being a part of like the struggle, the side of struggle.
And the other thing is that right above that, there's canisters of beans and then a basket of corn, and then above that a little bit some squash, and there's that bee there. And at first we were thinking that the DNA strands were like referring to GMOs, but also because the bee is there and it has that same swirliness, it makes me think that it's actually maybe referring to like genetic diversity in crops. Instead of those, because it's like coming from the people there, like that isn't corporate baskets of food, that's like local food. So I feel like the DNA is this like genetic diversity, and that is part of resisting like monocrops and
Yeah, back to this, just before we finish up the tourism scene, because I think there's a whole other scene about the market that you see behind there. Does anyone else have thoughts about these sort of two different images of these animals and what dynamic that's talking about?
Is it kind of like when you go to like a resort, people say, oh, the locals are so nice, the locals are so happy, everyone's great, but you don't really leave the resort. Sort of like the employees of the tourism industry versus the actual locals who are actually living there. And maybe the employees live there too, but like they're sort of paid to be nice, and it's all part of like the corporate act.
And they're behind like something, so they can't actually be on the beach, right? That's the resorty thing too, is that they can't actually afford to like live there. They're left behind. Yeah, and these are animals that like originally lived. This is their beach, and there's this sort of the chompy teeth have come here to like unwind, and they have this illusion of like empty beaches. They're arriving to empty beaches
And happy, welcoming locals.
Yeah, but those locals are kind of this one-dimensional, like almost a minstrel show, very racist depiction, one-dimensional depiction of who they really are. Yeah.
Yeah, I just noticed it was cut off on our little section here, but what I just noticed is there are these plans that these multinationals are making, and they're trickling down, and they go from these plans to little roads that are being paved through this area. So
yeah, you could look at this thing for hours, and the images all do kind of like run into one another, and all the stories are really connected with each other. Unfortunately, we have to wrap up in the next like 5 minutes or so we can't get into them all at the moment. But thank you so much for coming up and sharing. So I guess I'm glad that we got a chance to go through all the scenes, or some of the scenes. I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to look at all of them. In the last few minutes that we have together, I'm just wondering, do folks have questions?
Yeah. Can you talk about a little bit about the Beehive Collective, who you are, how, like you said, this took many years. What do you use it for?
Yeah, so the Beehive Collective has historically been a group of artists, activists, and educators who make these graphics and then use them for education work. At the moment, the collective is in a pretty big period of transition. It's really changing and turning into more of like a sort of network of autonomous educators and artists doing different kinds of projects.
So it's less of like one cohesive group. But yeah, so, and it's, the group is like the people who worked on this image, for example, and the other images that they've had, is a very like changing group of people, and the artists choose to remain anonymous because they want the emphasis to be on the stories that were shared and on the content. And they are anti-copyright images, which means that anybody can use them as long as it's not to make a profit. So that's particularly why I'm really interested in introducing this tool to teachers, because you know, you can use it in your classroom. You can, there's like high resolution copies of the images online that you can print and download, along with like a ton of information. So you don't have to be a member of the collective to do education work with these images. Yeah.
I'm a little curious about the master plan for this. Was a group set, did they have the responsibility of saying, well, this is how we want it all to to take shape, or were the individual artists allowed, you know, a certain section, or how did that take place?
Yeah, well, there was a lot of process of being guided by the people sharing their stories, and there were many rounds of conversation. So, for example, you know, in that scene about militarism that we saw, the initial first draft that the artists made, all of these soldiers were just generic soldiers. And when they brought that back to those communities that had shared their stories, they were like, this is wrong. It's not just soldiers. There's like, you know, there's private, there's like undercover cops, there are like,
technology.
Yeah, death squads, there are high-tech soldiers from the United States, or like with weapons from the United States, and there are sort of like, just all of these different like private military contractors, and so they wanted, they're like, you know, giving edits on the art, or different, like the scene that, that with the ants using trash to blockade that truck. For example, the artists chose like all different sort of the most bumpy species of ants, because those were teenagers who carried out that action. So they chose like the most sort of gangly, bumpy ant species to like give a shout out to those teenagers. And those were all conversations that happened like between the artists and the communities to figure out how they wanted their stories to be drawn in this. And so that, like, throughout the years, many of those conversations happened, and then there were several artists and kind of key planners who put it together in the structure that we ended up with now. And those decisions were sort of made, like, over time. It went through many different versions and iterations and layouts. So it was a very long and collaborative process. There wasn't like one person with a master plan at the beginning. Yes.
Can you just say what is Mesoamerica?
Yeah, so Mesoamerica literally means Middle America, and it's the area from like southern Mexico down to Panama.
You know, do you have a suggested like lesson plan on your website for like how you present this at first to kids or in a classroom, or do you just kind of just suggest like we take pieces? Like, do you have any suggestions on how to like present this to classrooms or to like people?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there are like a million different things to do with it.
Like there's so many directions.
Yeah, and depending on the ages of the kids, like for younger kids, often because there's also a lot of information in here about like ecosystems, and like there's a whole scene about pollination and how that works, and it's also a metaphor for social movements, but it's like you can play a lot of games with kids about pollination and like learn more about animal species in there or with older kids. Often I like to start out by like having people do some kind of treasure hunt, like look through and find this or find that, find an animal that's doing something that you also like to do, or you know, find an example of where there's conflict and what do you think that's about, or I mean, there's a lot of different ways that you can find a way in. I'd be happy to talk with you more about it, and I'm also always excited to hear from educators their ideas, because I think probably you, in seeing this, can think of a lot of different things to do with it.
I sense there's no like structured like presentation on your website of like this is how to, you can just like be creative.
No,
Okay.
yeah, we don't have, at the moment, we don't have like a curriculum thing for teachers, yeah.
Immediately when I looked at this, the first thing I saw was Fibonacci's rule everywhere, and the fact that 90% of nature follows Fibonacci's rule and 10% adapts. And traditionally, it's in native cultures, it's adaptation is traditional, and it's traditional to adapt. So I could see using it to teach about adaptation and Fibonacci's rule.
Cool.
How detailed, just coming back to the teaching of this, how detailed, like if you wanted to have a group of high school students look at this, how much detail do you provide on those? I saw you did some like bump outs. Do those give details, specific details about what some of the scenes were about? I mean, enough so kids could do some research on them, or?
Yeah, so the little bump out thing does provide some information. Can't see it very well up there. It's not a ton, but it does kind of give you an idea of like what you could research, like where you could, what things you could look at to find out more about that scene. And there's also, we have for download on the website like a little booklet that has sort of a more in-depth narrative about it that can kind of provide a starting place at least to know where to do more research. Yeah.
I've been using the true cost of coal one with my 7th grade science class. And I was just wondering, because I usually have them go and like they create stories based on what they're seeing in the image, and then it kind of opens up discussion. But this is kind of cool to be able to print like smaller pieces, or is this available?
Yeah, so basically I just made those by taking the high-res image online and just doing it like a screenshot and printing it.
Cool.
And you can absolutely do that. Like,
sweet.
As long as you're not selling it to make a profit, like you can do that in whatever context you want,
Great.
even for like a poster for a protest or like class projects or whatever.
Cool.
Definitely.
Emma, I think I'm back.
Yeah. Yeah,
We're
thank
gonna
you so
wrap up.
much.
Yeah, Emma's gonna be around later. We've invited Daniel Sicken to come play. Woo! Woo! I pronounced your last name right. I didn't even know. Sicken. Okay. Who is a local activist, an environmental activist, and an anti-war activist. He's been doing a lot of really important work here in Brattleboro for a long time, and we're really honored to have you here coming and playing some of your music. So thank you so much. There's going to be some call and response, so everyone's going to need to come on in, start coming back in, and getting into the music. Yeah!
Well, the first song is Teach Peace, and people will find a way. And you can come in with different things, 2 words. Anyway, you'll get the hang of it. Have to get just the right spot for us there. Find a way. On the vigil line for the last almost 5 years outside of TD Bank. For those of you who don't know, we do a vigil outside of TD Bank every Friday from 12 to 1. The reason is TD Bank is a big funder of the oil pipelines, the tar sands pipelines that are trying to go through. They're having a difficult time because of us. Because of you, everybody that's opposing them. So this song came out of that. Our affinity group was opposed to the Kinder Morgan pipeline that went through Massachusetts, and it got stopped because of all the resistance in Massachusetts. The scientists are showing us what's false and what is true. Let's organize and energize to lower the CO2. Keep it in the ground, keep it in the ground. The sound that's going around is keep it in the ground. Keep it in the ground, keep it in the ground. Start over. Scientists are showing us what's false and what is true. Let's organize and energize to went up the hill, fetch a pail of water. She looked down, the water's brown. She said, ever after. Keep it in the ground, keep it in the ground. I woke up laughing, I could not stop. Bill McKibben and the Koch brothers were dancing to hip-hop. Gonna go up a little bit. The sun circles the earth. The earth is flat. Climate change is a hoax. What do you make of that? Morgan was a horse. There's no pipeline. Pipeline, of course. Keep it in the ground, keep it in the ground. by Utah Phillips. Sometimes our living is so dark and lonesome, like there's nothing we can do. So we reach out to each other, sing a song together, let our voices carry us through. We are singing through the hard times, singing through the hard times, looking for the good times to come. We are singing through the hard times, singing through the hard times, looking for the good times to come. That's your part. We are singing through the hard times, looking for the good times to come. When the war clouds gather, it's easy to get angry. When the war clouds gather, it's so easy to get angry. It's hard not to be afraid, but we know in our own hearts, no matter what happens, we just can't turn our back and run away. We are singing through the hard times, singing through the hard times, looking for the good times to come. We are singing through the hard times, singing through the hard times, looking for the good times to come. So hand in hand together, we help each other carry that light of peace within us every day. And learn to live it, walk and talk and live it, and all the peace will be so far away. We are singing through the hard times, singing through the hard times, looking for the good times to come. We are singing through the hard times, singing through the hard times, looking for the good times to come. One more time. We are singing through the hard times, singing through the hard times, looking for the good times to come. We are singing through the hard times, singing through the hard times, looking for the good times to come. Thank you.
So our first panel is on education as liberation. My name's Lauren Pearlstein, and I'm a Spark graduate. I'm a member of Brattleboro Solidarity, and I'm a school librarian in Putney, Vermont. And, I'm excited to be facilitating this panel with another fellow librarian and teachers and educators. So today we'll be talking about education as liberation. As educators and learners, we must push back against schooling that trains us to conform
and instead create spaces of critical investigation of the world and our histories. In doing this, we can better understand the present challenges and act to creatively transform our world. Education must be a part of our collective liberation. Our panelists today will share how they stand up to build an equitable human community in and outside the classroom. And so today we have on our panel, Judy Dow is here on the far left, and here's my paper. She is a nationally known activist and artist and educator, and she brings a Benaki culture and native practices into everything she does. And our next panelist, is Star Electronica, who is fellow librarian, and she is the director of the Brooks Memorial Library in Brattleboro, and she has spent over 3 decades as a youth services librarian, and she's a very good friend to Brattleboro Solidarity. And next we have Taina Easley, who is Asili, I apologize, a New York-based Puerto Rican singer, filmmaker, and activist. And she's been touring the nation, performing, workshopping, and speaking at colleges, high schools, conferences, all across the nation, educating about topics of art and social change. So welcome. And finally, we have Janaki Natarajan here, and she is so many things. Founder, co-director of the Spark Teacher Education Institute, an abundant wealth of experience and knowledge within education all around the world, and so much. But we will start with. And each panelist will have about 7 minutes to answer or to talk about education as liberation and talk about examples of miseducation or liberation in your experience and how we can create liberation practices in the educational spaces that we are in. And then afterwards we'll have hopefully about 10 to 15 minutes for questions and answers. So we can get started. Judy, take it away.
So I want to apologize. I'm going to have to leave in the middle of the panel. I am representing my colleagues in the SPARK program this year by presenting to the Board of Trustees at Marlboro College. So I have to like turn my hat around, but I'll be back. So I wanted to start with a couple of quotes from history. The first one is from Benjamin Franklin in a speech he gave in 1784 when he described a conference or a communication that he had had with the Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, Mohawk, and Tuscarora. And he starts with savages, we call them, because their manners differ from ours, which we think the perfection of civility. They think the same of theirs. And he continues, after the principal business was settled, the commissioners from Virginia acquainted the Indians by a speech that there was at a Williamsburg college with a fund for educating Indian youth, and that if the Six Nations would send down a half a dozen of their young lads to this college, the government would take care that they should be well provided for and instructed in all the learning of the white people. It is one of the Indian rules of politeness not to answer a public proposition the same day that it is made. They think it would be treating it as a light manner, and that they show it respect by taking time to consider it and as a matter of importance. They therefore defer their answer till the day following. In making them that offer, for we know, says he, quote, that you highly esteemed the kind learning taught in these colleges, and that the maintenance of our young men while with you would propose, and we thank you heartily. But you know, who are wise must know the different nations have different education concepts of things, and you will therefore not take amiss if our ideas of this kind education happen not to be the same as yours. We have some experience of it. Several of our young men were formerly brought up at the College of the Northern Provinces, and they were instructed in all of your sciences, but when they came back to us, they were bad runners, ignorant of every means of living in the woods, unable to bear either cold or hunger, knew neither how to build a cabin, take a deer, or kill an enemy, spoke our language imperfectly, were therefore neither fit for hunters, warriors, or counselors. They were totally good for nothing. We are, however, not the less obliged for your kind offer, though we decline accepting it, and to show our grateful sense of it, if the gentlemen of Virginia would send us a dozen of their sons, we would take great care of the education instructed them in all that we know and make men of them. So many of you probably heard that before, but I like to start with that because it shows that there are different knowledges, and that that there is a time today to braid knowledges not together, not treat them as separate individual styles of learning. And so that philosophy went on for a while, as did the battles. And then in 1870, along came Carlisle Boarding School, which was formed by Richard Pratt, who modeled the boarding school method on Indian prisons that he had been managing. And his thoughts were to take the Indian child and educate them in ways that would civilize them. And in that, he meant for them to be servants and farmers and laborers. And he meant that to be civilized people. They were beaten for speaking their language in their school, and they were discouraged from connecting to their family and have that family relationship. And Richard Pratt is pretty famous for that quote that you often hear, kill the Indian in him and save the man. And that's what boarding schools were part of. And then that was followed by eugenic programs. Here in Vermont, there were 17 institutions in which children were taken from their families and placed into facilities to take the Indian out of them. And then with that breaking up of, during eugenics, that breaking up of family came loss of continuity, loss of history, and loss of connection to family, which are the very circles that gets you recognition. Most schools today don't have appropriate literature. You seldom pick up a book where you see a picture that looks like an Indian person. Many times they're not culturally appropriate. The art activities aren't culturally appropriate. And those are the things I work for today to help make change. I'm the executive director of an organization called Gadakina, and we help our women and our children to self-determine, and we do it through education. and we work with their teachers, because the biggest problem we have now is that the current administration and Betsy DeVos is putting Masters of Business MBAs in as principals of schools. And they have no educational background, no cultural background, and their goal, as Fred talked about, is to run the schools as a business. And so we do a lot of educational training for teachers and parents, and we're moving forward with that.
Thank you, Judy.
You're welcome. Thank you. I'll see you all later.
Star, you can
take it away. Okay, so luckily Judy and I had a little chat beforehand, and I'm going to continue along on some of those things. But first I just want to say that, yes, I devoted over 3 decades to being a youth services librarian, because I really feel there is no more important or more fun job in the world than that. And when Lauren talked about creating an equitable human community, the library is perfectly positioned to do just that, because we are all about equity. We're about access for all. And so I feel grateful to have been part of such an honorable tradition all these years. I came to librarianship because of the difference it made in my life, and because I recognize that truly literacy is the roadmap to all other learning. And so if we want kids to be able to learn, they need to be able to write, and they need to be able to access that information. We know the history of using illiteracy as a tool of oppression, that, you know, that slaves were not allowed to learn to read and write. Many oppressed people were not allowed to learn to read and write because it slowed down communication and education. So I took that as my banner and moved forth. I will say just briefly that in my own personal life, well, first of all, I want to know how many people here have library cards? All right, then. Anybody that didn't raise their hand should speak to me. So I realized the importance once I got a library card of what that meant to me. I did grow up in a welfare household with a single mother who was mentally ill, so my brother and I spent a lot of time in and out of foster care. But what that did was my mother did, however, extremely value education. And there was never any question that I would go to college and that I would read. And so what reading did for me was to open whole new worlds. And I could see ways that other people behaved and that other people lived. And so that's what I wanted to bring to all the kids of the world. So having access to materials in the library to see those other worlds, and having vested adults, in other words teachers, who got me those books, who got me to the library and showed me the books that I needed to make, to have an impact on my life, really made me the person that I am today. So, like I said, I want to bring that to all children, and so the first part of that is access. And the great thing about the public library is it is free for all. It's a free for all. That's what I like about it. And anybody who was at the event last night knows that. So access is very important. Access can be problematic for kids. I often confess in public, and I will do it now in front of the camera even, that because I grew up in a chaotic household, we could not get our books back to the library on time, and I constantly struggled with library fines. And so by the time I was in 5th grade, I was getting library cards under assumed names. So I don't want to lead other young people down that path. So I have always been an advocate of no fines, and I am so pleased and I am so proud of our Board of Library Trustees and our town government that they have supported Brooks Memorial Library being fine-free. Yeah. We all recognize library fines are punitive and they disproportionately affect people with limited means. And so now that is one barrier that's been removed, so I'm delighted. Another thing that's a little more problematic is, you know, kids needing their parents' signatures. And actually, when I first came to Brooks, there was a policy that parents' cards had to be clear of fines before the kids' cards could be clear of fines. But I said, you know, I don't know a lot about religion, but I think there's something about the sins of the father it's not supposed to happen. And so luckily, again, our board said, yes, we should change that. We should update that. And then, which then leads me to, okay, what are they getting access to? So, you know, certainly now we also have technology, but part of a youth services librarian's dictate is to make sure that they have access to accurate information. And so the conversation that Judy and I were having was about historical fiction and how oftentimes studies are supported through historical fiction because, you know, you want to give kids a broad, you know, a breadth of reading materials. But historical fiction is not really accurate in a lot of times, and certainly we've seen that over the past several years, that librarians have really conscientiously gone back and re-examined many of the classics. And so I will say that I'm proud to be a member of the task force that recommended that the Association for Library Service to Children change their Children's Legacy Award title from the Laura Ingalls Wilder Award to the Children's Literature Legacy Award, which says what it is, and which everyone can accept with pride. Like I said, librarians are really re-examining their collections. They're looking at those old classics, those classics that we grew up with and we loved and certainly imprinted our lives, but that really, do we want to recommend to kids that they read Peter Pan at this point? As much as we all may have loved it as a child. And so to that degree, I just want to mention a few resources that you're probably already aware of, but just in case. If you don't know the work of Debbie Reese, she is phenomenal. She has a blog and a website on American Indian literature for children, and she is absolutely fantastic. So she just also was the most recent deliverer of the Arbuthnot Lecture, which is the premium lecture for people involved in children's literature. Also, We Need Diverse Books. I'm sure you guys are all tuned into that, which is great. They have a read-alike column or a read-alike section, so if you liked this book, with all white characters, you would probably like this book too, which has, you know, a much more diverse cast of characters. There's a great blog called Reading While White, which examines old books and new books by children's literature authorities. And then the other thing that I really took home from hearing Debbie Reese speak once was, you know, a lot of us who are on Facebook see these great lists. Oh, great lists of, you know, books for holiday giving, and we think, oh yeah, that looks great, and then you automatically share that. Really take the time to look at what you're sharing, really take the time to look at what you're reposting on your Facebook page, which my daughter says I do way too much of. But make sure that those really are all titles that you can be proud of. And I think my time is up.
Thank you. R-E-E-S-E.
Thank you.
Sure.
So, I'm going to start by just giving a quick sample of what I do. This is my declaration to be fully alive, healing. This is my reclamation of my ancestral wisdom. The earth, it saved it for me, and I cleft the
start by sharing a song because I think it's a good way to kind of access what I do. I think that art is part of the power of art is that interchange, that exchange that happens with us that's vibrational, that goes beyond the words even. And I wanted to start by singing the snippet, the opening of my song called Plant the Seed, because I think that that's also the idea of what I'm doing, is planting seeds throughout the nation at various colleges, high schools, middle schools, elementary schools, through festivals. I perform at demonstrations, whether it's large demonstrations like the Women's March on Washington to grassroots demonstrations on mass incarceration and climate change. But I wanted to just rewind back a little bit to talk about how I got to this place. And as a true Boricua, or Puerto Rican, we always give thanks to our ancestors. And so I wanted to just begin with a little bit of a story of my ancestors. My grandmother, Abuelita Gloria, was born and raised in a rural area in the mountains of Puerto Rico. She was one of 11 children from a very poor family on a farm. And she had always wanted to go to school. And she found a way to get a boat to New York City at the age of 16 to become a child care provider for a woman who said that she would allow her to go to school if she were to go with her and take care of her children. And as my grandmother told me, that never happened. Unfortunately, she was never able to go to school. But what she did do was save and work her whole life to find the money for her children to go to school. Thankfully, because of affirmative action programs, my mother, who was born and raised in the Lower East Side in New York City, was able to go to Binghamton University, and she was sent with the money that my grandmother saved her whole life to be able to give her for her books. My father was raised in East Harlem, and he was formerly incarcerated. He had struggled with heroin addiction for a period of time in his life, got clean, went to, in prison, and was actually brought from prison straight to Binghamton University through affirmative action program, where he met my mother. So there they met, and there they founded the Latin American Student Union. And as I often tell the student groups that I speak to today, I'll ask them, what's the way that you start an organization, a student group at a high school or at a college? And they'll say, oh, we sign up at a student association and we find our people. And I explain to them the history of my parents' history and the history of student movements at that time. So my parents fought for that organization, the Latin American Student Union, through sit-ins and protests, demonstrations. I explained to them how students across the nation at that time were being arrested. There were students who were killed. I talk about this history and how it was fed through the social movements of that time. It's always surprising to me how many students aren't familiar with the social movements of the 1970s. And I speak to them about how my parents were inspired to start the Latin American Student Union because of the Young Lords in their community and the Black Panthers in the community. My father used to hear Malcolm X speak on his block when he was growing up. And so these were the influencers that inspired them to start this organization. And like is true for many Latin American student unions to this day, cultural arts is an important piece of the work that they did and the work that continues on today. So my parents were also the keepers of a Puerto Rican folkloric tradition descending from our African and Taino ancestors. This tradition is called bomba, la bomba puertorriqueña. And it's a folkloric tradition that uses drumming and dance and song. And it was used during a time during the slavery of African and Taino people to reclaim our humanity in the face of inhumanity, as a way to reclaim our cultural and spiritual traditions, and as a time to organize slave revolts when the slave masters would go away to church. So this tradition passed on from century to century to century, landing into my parents' hands, and they used this in a similar fashion during their era, using the cultural arts to reclaim that space where they were told they weren't allowed to be, to organize, to reclaim their cultural and spiritual traditions as they were being taken away from them. So this was the family that I was born into, pretty cool family, and they passed on these musical art forms to me. Now, I didn't grow up in, I didn't grow up, oh, that's my timer. I didn't grow up in New York City. I didn't grow up in Puerto Rico. I grew up in upstate New York. And I endured a lot of racism, sexism, and homophobia during my school experiences, some extreme physical and emotional abuse. And art became my way of addressing that abuse. And I'll talk a little bit more as we move into our discussion, but basically the picture of it is that today what I do is I fold in the tradition of my ancestors, the tradition of my parents, and also bringing in new traditions. I was involved in the punk scene and used to be educated by the Beehive Collective, and I do popular education. I go into, I do community workshops on music and social change, and continuing to fold the arts and the ancestral wisdom and offer that to our young people. So that's what I do.
Greetings, sisters, brothers, and comrades. Thank you for being here. The first thing I'd like to do is to acknowledge the two pillars in our Brattleboro community, Nancy Browse. Who didn't want to speak today, but I hope you will.
You don't need to speak.
You work for the the love for the soft chairs in her store that you can sit and read her books. And to the other pillar, to the re-acknowledged star. Women with strong backs. And libations to our ancestors. Who, however, some of whom we will follow, others of whom we will betray and be enemies to. But I just want to talk about, us as teachers and little things, because every breath that we draw and every word we speak has to have our meaning, the one that's in us, as to how we wish to see the world. And I'd ask you to put aside Piaget and so on, stages of development, stages of morality. Put those aside for the moment. Clear the deck. But I remember a 4-year-old asking me, oh, look, let's play together. Let's build a castle and with lots of blocks. And so I said, okay, what do you want to build? A castle. Who lives in a castle? The king and queen, don't you know? Right, great. Okay, so we built this, and it was a large edifice that we were able to build. So I said, who lives here, did you say? The king and queen. 2 people? 2 people. So who built this? You and I. But who would build it if we built it in the world, out there? That's Brecht's poem that you should recognize by now. But in any case, so she said, but all the people built it. So I said, 2 people live in, all these people build it. Can't we live all together in there? Because where do these people go and live? Every word, every breath. And in this particular case, we are teaching about labor. right? We're teaching about privilege of wealth and accumulation, right? And we're also talking about the possibilities of the future without too many utopian overtones to it. You know, it's practical, it's here, it's common sense. What's the matter with you? So who owns, who labors, and who benefits, and who has the power to benefit, right? So that's one story. The other story is from South India, where, as all of you know, we have a very strong caste system, which now has metamorphosed, because it's all about the division of labor in a society, into class, and class formations. And the kind of modalities may be different, but the essence is the same. Who owns, who labors, and who benefits. So in the school that I'm talking about, we all clean the latrines. Latrines, everybody? Yeah? And that is strictly caste-based. And so this man comes up to me with the ash in his forehead, which denotes his caste, with a child, and says, Amma, listen, I hear that in this school you have to clean the latrines. My grandson won't clean the latrines. So I said, oh, why not? Because he's a Brahmin. Right? So then the question becomes a lesson in the classroom. We ask the children, what do you eat? You like to eat? Yeah, we love to eat, right? Okay, where does it go? You know, we eat with our hands. It goes in here and here and here. Where else does it go? Where does it go? Where does it go? So you mean that when it comes out it's dirty and somebody else has to come and pick it up? And that is what the Dalit, which is the former untouchable, is to break that staff. So when it comes, so I said, but is there some still left over inside? So wait a minute, you still have some shit in your bodies. But when it comes out, it's dirty. So how can science break through that? How can scientific thinking, or how science is taught, break through that in order to overturn a historical edifice, religiously sacred, which is about who owns, who labors, and who benefits, and is about exploitation? Who has that task in hand? Everyone does, but who teaches the teacher to have that task in hand? Jose Marti's question. Who teaches the teacher? And we are faced with the same problems, whether it's in faraway India or whether it's here. And here, the school and its school system and its structure reproduces the capitalist system, the social relations of capital, the deep ideologies that are necessary for capitalism to exist and reproduce. And the school is the main mechanism that does that. The prison is one of the edifices that continues and reproduces, because we must have poverty. We must have punishment. There are too many people. We can't have people challenging us on the street or in the school system, right? So what about the military? Yeah. And we have military recruiting in our schools. Don't let's forget. That is necessary. And what about the workplace? The workplace reproduces, mirrors the internal task of capital, the internal task of imperialism as the outcome and the higher stage of capitalism, if you like. So each of us have to figure out where our ideas come from. What do we think? What do we think about anything? And how do we teach this? But when we use the word miseducate, then we're already talking about principles. Do we really think that exploitation is against the people of the world and is against our principles, my principles? If it isn't, then you come out with one kind of teaching. If you think it is, then you come out with another kind of teaching, and those are antagonistic to each other. Maudun, it's a struggle with each other. Sometimes one wins for a little while, the other times the other wins for a long time. And that, as you were saying, Fred, this morning, was very, very clear and very important. But there's a very interesting exchange in that talk, and I really want to just go to that for a minute. In our schools, we punish children. In our schools, we punish children for infractions of behavior, which actually, Judy's not here, is closely connected to eugenics. Testing now is closely connected to eugenics. So we punish a child. That's the immediate thing. That immediately will really create problems for that child. Could be black, brown, white, poor, you know, it's all of those things, and those elements of the child's life is in the hands of the system. So that's the immediate point. The Bronx is bombed. Philadelphia was bombed. Was bombed by when MOVE was there. The Bronx was destroyed. You all saw that last night in the workshop here. The pictures that you saw. That's the immediate. That is now. And as we fight against that at the moment, the punishment of that child in the school, those who we fight against are immediate, they're in our face. It's the primary aspect of that contradiction right now. Okay. So we have to face that, and we have to oppose it. Oppose it strongly, oppose it unified, and oppose it so it can have some basis of change. So that's anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist. Because remember, the school is the main reproduction of the capitalist system as we have it. So let's not forget that. So when we are talking about the punishment of that child, it's immediate. But at the same time, that immediate struggle for that child is also a blow against the system. Same in Gaza. And that was what was said this morning, which is so important. The Bronx, Gaza, Yemen, it's immediate. It's absolutely immediate. It's about physical bodies, mental systems. It's about religion. It's about all of that stuff mixed in the horrible cauldron that humanity creates. And so what we do then is to fight that at the moment. But that fighting has to be done in such a way that is also a sharp blow to capitalism. Sometimes it may not seem that way. Sometimes it does. And to have the wit and the acumen and the principle to see these takes study. But the problem is, as these children in Baba Grama, what do you want to become when you grow older? Oh, I want to become, a clerk or something. Oh, and your parents? Oh, they can't even read. Do they know anything? Could they be scientists? Could they be mathematicians? They're farmers. Oh, so they create food? So they don't know anything? So your hands are soft? Let's go touch your parents' hands who brought you here. Okay. So we are every single element in our minds has to be analyzed according to the tools and the principles that we have. And if we think that there should not be accumulation by a few on the backs of the many, if we think that we are capable, that we cannot stand it, that we just can't stand what is going on, then that should propel us, whether we are white or black, to be against racism. So that whiteness has a particular duty and a particular set of strategies against racism, just as Brahmins do in India and so on. So it's like this cleaning the shit, It's inside all the time, and it's there. You can't take a roto-rooter to it. It doesn't work that way. You can't take any laxatives the pharmaceuticals produce. It doesn't do that. Unfortunately, it takes a lot of unpleasant work. But I don't find it unpleasant. I find it enormously delightful because it's together with people like here. How dare we be depressed? I'm tortured by what's happening in Gaza. I mean, it just lives here. But at the same time, I see my comrade here. And his spirit and your spirit, comrades, both of you from different parts of that land, but the same. And you'll get to know them. And the two Indians, you know, Columbus made a mistake, right? We do that little skit sometimes. So anyway, I'll stop with that and then we can go on.
So we can take a little time for questions and answers from our panel here. So if you have any questions or comments, we can do that for, how much time? Is there a 10 minutes? Sounds good. Anna?
Yeah, I have a question for Star. So part of the conversation that I hear in Brattleboro is about poor people on the streets, right? We know this. And also a lot around addiction. And a lot of placing that under like blaming the person. And I also hear certain places or businesses saying, it's not our problem, and we don't want, I don't know what you call them, well, places to put a syringe in. I'm curious your thought around that, because I know that libraries are also dealing with this issue, and what you think about that.
So one of the things that really drew me to Brattleboro was, you know, when I was researching the library, when I was applying for the job, was that they have a code of conduct, as all libraries do. Some even in enlightened communities like Ithaca, New York, can be this huge laundry list of things you can't do in the library. Ours is very simple, and I can take no credit for this. It was already in place when I came here, but ours is the only library I'm aware of that doesn't have a rule against sleeping in the library, which is sort of an undertone for, yeah, we don't want people without houses in here because then they'll sleep. And that's not all, you know, true of all libraries, but it is one way to sort of weed people out. But there's no rule against sleeping in our library. There is, and our code of conduct, or behavior code, treats just that. It treats the behavior. So if you are, you know, I think there are only 8 points, and one of them is if you're causing a disturbance that is disturbing or threatening to staff or public, you'll be asked to leave. And that goes for anybody. If it goes for somebody that's complaining that, you know, they can't get the latest issue of the New Yorker because somebody else is reading it and they're doing it in a loud voice, we ask them to quiet down. It's the same if somebody who's coming in and is having a bad episode day is particularly loud and vocal. We ask them to, you know, to calm down and, you know, bring their voice down. But we don't, we don't ask people to leave because they don't have money. In fact, we welcome them. That's sort of the nature of libraries. And that they truly are there for everybody. And we know, people who have been involved with libraries for a long time, we know what a huge difference it can make to a person to have access, not just to education that they can get at the library, but also sometimes just the humanity and compassion of having an interaction with another person, and having, after spending all night on the street, having to keep one eye open to make sure your stuff is okay, to have a place to sit down and take a deep breath and maybe catch a little bit of a nap. So like I said, our list is pretty short. You have to keep your shoes on anyway. But, though I did notice a few people last night, we didn't say that. And as far as the people that are struggling with addiction, we know there are people that need our space, our services. We're conscious of that. Our staff has been trained in administering Narcan, and we have that on the premises. Knock wood, or whatever this is, we haven't had to use that, but we recognize that this is a huge public health issue. We're a public institution, and we have a role to play and the support to get there.
Thank you.
And we ask you all to join us.
You were talking about the importance of creating space for students, and that being politicizing for students. And so many of us here in this room are teachers, and so I'm wondering if you could talk about what kind of spaces should we create? What should those spaces be full of? How can we let children fill them? How should we guide them? Your experience doing those things.
It's a big question.
Sorry.
I'll do my best. I think where I would have headed if I had time to finish my piece is that I ended up going to Goddard College and getting my master's in transformative language arts. And so I have developed curriculum for students that is really about exploring our creative potential. And I think, I go to a lot of places. I'll ask in this room, how many of you consider yourselves an artist? How many of you consider yourselves creative? So, one of the things that we talk about is that creativity is part of our human birthright. And that when we use our creativity, it allows us to open ourselves to creative thinking, creative ways of thinking about solutions to our world's problems, creative ways of approaching whatever subject we're looking at. Creativity is an essential piece of our humanity. So part of, I think, what I see when I visit middle schools, high schools, colleges is that somehow that piece has been taken away. And I'm not just talking about music programs and art programs being cut, and we all know how that's happening across the nation. It's epidemic. But also just allowing creativity to be folded into every aspect of education, and so one of the things that I offer is having a space to explore our creativity. So we do that with the work that I do. We do that through talking about different social justice issues, and we use songwriting as a tool to talk about it. So one thing that I'll do is I'll come in and do a workshop called Songwriting for Social, Reclaim the Thunder, Songwriting for Social Change. And I'll offer to students to pick a topic that's important to them, that's impacting them. And then we will explore that topic through discussion and then use songwriting tools to explore that topic further. In small groups and then in large groups, and then we at the end will come together and perform these songs for one another. And I have yet to be unimpressed with that process. I think a lot of students and adults that I do this with will feel very apprehensive and scared and feel like I don't even know how to get to that place. Many people don't want to perform in front of other people. And inevitably, everybody participates, and it feels a sense of excitement and joy at the end of it. But what I think is most interesting is that when their story, when their experiences are brought to the song, for myself as an artist, I write songs about my own experiences, about the social justice movements that I'm a part of, and that process is very cathartic and really important for my creative thinking and mind. But when I perform it, when I sing it aloud, when I speak that truth to power, I'm learning something new, I'm affirming something new, and I'm gaining, receiving, I'm expressing my resilience, I'm expressing, that and being witnessed. There's so much I could share about that to answer your question, but I would say that, folding in creativity in whatever way, the arts in whatever way you can, into whatever subject you have, and allowing, particularly in answer to addressing issues of social change, social justice. You know, for example, I have a music video that I created about mass incarceration. I'm also a filmmaker and director. We'll use that film to explore a topic, this really difficult topic of mass incarceration. We'll use other creative tools to be able to kind of process through that experience, because sometimes, you know, just discussion, you know, even for myself as an artist, starting at the beginning with singing, discussion, speaking with these kind of words isn't always all that we need, you know, to be able to share our truth, share our experience and process. So that's a bit of what I would offer.
So John, I have a question for you, because you mentioned, I'm just curious, since I teach at the school, and I see this prison industrial complex on a daily basis, especially with students living in poverty, students of color being tracked by the administration. Like, give me something to grab onto, like what would you, if you were in my position and you're seeing this happen, like what are some, like maybe a strategy or two that you could do to intervene, because you said you should intervene at that moment, you know, and I find it sometimes, I see it happening, I have difficulty doing it, like thinking, I mean, I know we have the restorative justice with Mike Sostak, which is important, you know, it's one element of the pushing back at that, but do you have thoughts about what can be done in that way? I mean, is it organizing with other people in the department, or, you know, how do you confront that when you see it in the school like this, you know, on a, you know, weekly basis at least, or maybe more quickly?
Do you feel that your work might get you fired?
You mean if I did intervene at that moment? I think about it sometimes, yeah. Yeah.
Do other people? Do be fired?
Yay!
So, you know, so there's a whole institution which is full of fear and anxiety and anything except any sort of utopian purity of affection and love for the children, you know. So we're in this world while we fight against it, okay? So, and of course, as you know, I've been a school teacher and faced this. First of all, do we have, I mean, that moment is there, but have we done some work to have our backs covered? Do we have a group? Have we tried to figure out a group? Have we tried to penetrate the union in some way? Okay? And so on and so on. Those are the other larger questions. But there's always the moment when the confrontation happens. Oh, those girls gave me the permission to use the N-word. You know, the example that you gave us to discuss, right? Or that's being used against us, the custodial person says, or something. It's always complicated, right? Because it has to be complicated in the system. They cannot be simple answers to do with humans. Bourgeois morality confuses issues, but the morality of humans in this way does not. Can you express love? Can you express, you know, to the two girls? You shouldn't be saying that either. Then somebody will come up with all kinds of other issues, right? I know of no other answer except in the moment to confront it myself with the child if I'm involved in it. Restorative justice is a half-assed way of doing stuff. And I was brought up in the Gandhian movement. And it's sort of like taking it out of the social context and reconciling two antagonistic forces. And Michael is amazing. I mean, I just, you know, I've seen his work, our person. And he does a marvelous job within that situation. But is it placating the contradictions? Who is being kicked out of the school? Who's being suspended? Who's being published? You know, so that constant conversation and study group is the long stuff and confronting it at the moment with total and unconditional love. I have no other answer from my personal self.
Do we have time for one more? Maybe one more? Kelly, go ahead.
Jonathan, I was wondering if you could talk more about the connection between eugenics and punishment of kids in schools.
Punishment of what?
Children. Punishment of children in schools.
Well, I mean, there's no better example of the eugenic system in many ways than the caste system. Yes, Ziad.
Yeah, sometimes for teachers actually to face certain kinds of challenge. How teachers can they deal with the students when history punish the students? For example, we were speaking about the Native American, and this is I'm following like with teachers, working with teachers actually in a reservation in New Mexico, where one of the teachers, he told us, one of the main issues they face, that the young students, they are very suicidal. And when they go deep, it's the history punishing these students in the schools. And here I'm not speaking just about the reservations. We have many schools now diverse, people coming from different backgrounds. Like during the ban, the Muslims ban, most of the students coming from Muslims ban background, they were freaked out. They were scared, they can't focus. Or now the borders, deportation, how teachers can deal with this kind of issue when it comes to social justice and liberation.
I know that you've done this a great deal yourself, so you really, I hope you'll talk with us.
I am the wrong person, actually. No, it's okay. Go ahead.
But I think that this is connected to the eugenics question too.
Yeah.
Because every single testing, curricular moments, textbooks, right? And we have enough tests now, and the IQ test and every other kind of test. There are so many instruments within the school, systematically and beautifully calibrated to create the conditions in the society which will allow exploitation. And I can name for you, and you can name for me, Kelly, I know, and Ziad definitely, what those wisps and not so many wisps and strands are which do that. And the division that we must have between us is necessary. The competition and the commodification that Fred talked about, the buying and all the rest of it, every single element is in one direction only in this system. And it's the economic system which creates all this. And that economic system is about profit and its accumulation and commodification in order to. So the tests are commodified, the humans are commodified. So like the caste system, it has to be divided. The border has to stay that way. And look, the border is a tiny example of what's going to be in the future with climate change. This is, you know, who's going to move? Bangladesh? How many millions are we going to move out of there, et cetera, et cetera. So who is allowed to move, who is not allowed to move? All of that is eugenics, if you will, or based on the idea that certain people are Brahminical, elite, Boston, whoever you have, right, who are considered worthy of saving and worthy to wear the silks and whatever else. And this is so deep that I can bet you that all of us have this shit in our bowels. So what do we do? Meditation, yoga, I can tell you one word. Antidepressants, I don't think will work either. You know, so what do we do? What is the political way in which we can change the relationships amongst humans to be anti-eugenicist, which exists now? You know, that's the wonderful part of the struggle.
All right, I think that's what we have time for.
we have 3 panelists with us today. We're really grateful to have them here. With Amy Frost. 4, I'm sorry, 4. 3 different sections, 4 panelists, yes, sorry. That's right. So Amy Frost started working at the farm in 2004. There's 1. Sorry. That's 1 and 2. Amy Frost is a local farmer. She's going to tell you a little bit about her life, what she does as a farmer, and there's a question that I'll share with you in a minute. 2 questions that I'm hoping the panelists will walk through us with. And then we have Rose Webster-Smith and David Dunwell. They work with an organization called No One Leaves in Springfield, Massachusetts. Housing organization that tries to keep people in their homes and keeping away from being foreclosed and pushed out by the large banks. A lot of these organizations sprung up around the 2007 and 8 housing crisis where banks were trying to foreclose people out of their homes. And then we have Suzanne Love, who is a dedicated union worker and is a nurse at Bay State Franklin Medical Center in Greenfield, Mass. And is active in the healthcare struggle in this current reality that we live in. The 2 questions we're asking our panelists, in addition to giving us a little background, is what is the effect of this kind of privatization of food, healthcare, and housing? What kind of effect does that have on the human populations? And then secondarily, the second follow-up question is how can we humanize all 3 of those things to make those 3 things human rights? What things can we do as people to make those, and as groups, to make those things guaranteed human rights and not something to be made profit off of? So those are the, take it away, guys. Thanks.
You want to start, Amy? Sure. So, I was born and raised in Brattleboro and came back here this is the 16th farm season that I've been farming next to the house that I grew up in Guilford. I came to being a farmer, I came to it, I grew up in a farming community, I had no interest in farming as a kid. And then as I became a teenager, it sort of emerged as like a thing that actually made sense for me to do. To basically live, I think, as a sort of human animal, right? To survive, to homestead, to have a home, to have food, to be outside, to work. And so, for me, I went to college. I dropped out of college because UVM's major stockholding was in Monsanto at the time, and I was spending all of my time doing activist work, and I was failing my classes anyway, and so I left and I went and lived, in my van on the streets, which for me, I have folks, they're very supportive, they continue to be supportive. My sort of experience as being a poor person is my own experience. But I confronted my fear of doing things motivated by, how financially secure I was going to be. And that was a pretty profound experience for me, empowering, damaging, that's, I think a lot of people have things to say about, what scarcity sort of does to hold you down and bring you up at the same time. So anyway, I'm farming, and it's a business. I grow food, I sell it. I'm a farm owner. I identify as a farm worker because I work. I don't have employees so much. I have a partner. Some people work sometimes, but I identify as a farm worker. And so for me, farming is social justice work. It came out of my political disillusion with the world and feeling like we were really, that really nothing made sense to me. And I appreciate just doing something that on a very visceral human level, I think it's very simplistic for me. It's just a basic human need, and I contribute to that for myself. I get tons of secondary gain, I get to work for myself, need to be outside, I get, you know, halfway fit, halfway broken, doing the work. People pay lots of money for that kind of opportunity, so. There's things that I get that are, that for other people are part of the recreation, right, the recreation kind of culture. So I'm like super privileged to be farming and to, you know, make, I think I made like $8,000 last year. And to me, that's like, I ride the line. I mostly feel like that's a success because I'm still here. I drove here in a car. You know, I do stuff for fun at night sometimes. You know what I mean? I'm like, in a lot of ways, I'm like, how would I need any more than that? And you know, again, I have a lot of supports. So that's all cool. I'm not motivated by profit, but I live in the system. I'm a farm worker, but I'm also a farm owner, and I bring food to market. And you know, Fred said some stuff about marketing and how you kind of song and dance or convince people to buy your stuff. And food's funny because we need it, but like, I don't know if anyone in this room actually needs what I grow, because there's tons of food in this town. You know, I know for myself, I could access food out of, you know, the food pantry, the dumpster. That there's so much opulence that, like, how necessary is it for me to farm? I don't know. What sets my stuff apart from anyone else's? I don't know. And I hate the song and dance because I'm tired. It's a sham. There's not really. I don't need to set that. You know, people eat the food if they want to eat the food, and that sort of, in a lot of ways, I think that makes me a very poor organizer, right? You know, like, what am I actually, what sort of additional effort am I putting out to make these connections with my community about what we could do. So capitalism, commodification, and collaboration. I think that I feel like I'm pretty, I will jump into collaborative projects, and I've jumped into a lot of collaborative projects around farming. And I think embedded in all of this are the effects of commodification and capitalism. There's competition, which is, it's hilarious, right? If you're like at farmer's market and you're trying to sell lettuce, and you're trying to, like, this lettuce is really, this is really important. It's really important that you support me because, you know, I have a cool thing to say, or whatever. You know, to collaborate with other farmers, to support one another with labor, or I don't like to grow carrots, but you're really good at it, so can we, like, come together on that? It's tricky because there's, like, branding, right? And there's ego. And I think that, like, some of those ideals, like, I grew up here, and so I have that, like, white New England self-reliance, you know, like, to the bone, just, like, trudge through. And I embody that a lot, which is, like, gets harder as I get older to, like, feel like that makes sense. So there's power in that self-reliance, but the mutual aid is, like, that's a real kind of leap of faith to not brand yourself, to not sort of take a risk, like the risk and reward of working with other people. There's power dynamics in selling food, because, you know, and I'll say to people, I'll, like, out myself, I'll out my class, which is complicated because, you know, it's my parents' land,
and all this shit, right? But like what I make and like the hours of work that I do in my current life, just, you know, what sort of I have control over today, I'll out myself because it feels shitty to sell things and get money. That's like that becomes like a capitalist kind of thing that happens. And that's a crazy thing. And so I guess one thing I wanted to say, kind of pare it down to farm work, like to bring youth onto the farm. I love hanging out with youth and saying, you know, like, hey, like you could like grow some food and then like you have this security, or you have, you know, food is power and it's like fun and cool, and maybe you have to like say like yes to your boss who you hate a little bit less because you like feel like you have a little bit of a cushion for skills, right? These are just like skills for living, you know? You like to organize, to fix shit that we use, to grow food. To have those skills is really great. But to sell that to kids, it's not a viable job. It's not a good idea to like get into farming. And it's like, it's, you know, like Fred was saying, it's founded on slavery. It is entrenched in slavery. And so the entitlements of people to think like, I don't have to get my hands dirty. I don't have to clean the latrine, right? I just want this thing. That's my right, right? We all get food. Who grows the food? I mean, me, I'm like, I'm fine. I'm not like getting hunted at night by cops, or I'm not getting tortured. But I have a taste of that. I have a taste of that like hard work for no money kind of thing. And so it's hard to sell to other people, like take responsibility for yourself and grow food, or like, you know, maybe if we all cooperated we could like grow food together and then we wouldn't have to feed into the system. So it becomes like it's a part of that bigger system. How do you change it without really like making the whole leap outside of the system? And like, so I think food has like a great place there, but the production of food is totally caught within that, within those cycles, those personal relationships, and the systematic relationships around, you know, how food's produced.
And most people know about Howard Zinn, A People's History of the United States. This is a young people's history of the United States, especially adapted for young people by Rebecca Steroff.
Thank you, Dan.